Hello, it's James.
Hey, it's Derek, and we're here for episode 2 of this podcast that we're working on, Community Corner. We haven't really come up with a title yet, working title coming soon, but basically it's a podcast where we talk about community building within government, something that both James and myself are hugely passionate about. So yeah, episode 2. So the topic I was going to put forward for episode 2, James, is this question around membership. Who's in, who's not. I know this is something that at Apolitical we're having lots of conversations around, and I know many of the communities I've been involved in building in government, this has also been a fairly intense conversation. And particularly the question is around people who aren't in government. Should people who aren't in government be allowed to be in the community? And I think it's a balance between wanting to create a safe space for public servants to connect, to collaborate, to share, to be vulnerable, and not be sold to. I think that's a key thing, is not be sold to, or not feel like what they're saying is going to be used and sold back to them later. On the flip side, there's a recognition that there's a lot of amazing people, a lot of amazing ideas that exist just outside of government, sort of on the fringes, and people move. So someone, I mean, you and I are a great example. We were both public servants for many years. Now we're both no longer public servants. Should we still be in these communities? Should we not be in these communities? So yeah, so that's the conversation I want to put to us to talk about today.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I mean, for me, it comes back to two things. First of all, like, well, what are the criteria for community membership, and where have you documented them? And were they sourced by the community? Are they kept up to date by the community? And then related is like the code of conduct. So that covers like all the kind of selling and mis-selling and all that kind of stuff. So I think between those two things, which maybe initially is created by the community manager, but should be agreed and ideally collaborated on by the whole membership, or the active membership at least. I think between those things, those two things, you can decide who is in and who is out. Yeah.
How did you guys do it with One Team Gov? Because One Team Gov is an example, I think, of a fairly open community.
There was only one person that ever was not allowed to attend, and that was, I think it was the One Team Gov global event that we did, where we had loads of sponsorship basically, and one of the sponsors was Cabinet Office, which is a central government department with quite a lot of power, considering its size. And there was one person that Cabinet Office said they cannot come to this event of 500 plus people because they're a journalist. That's the only time I ever know of someone not being allowed to come to a One Team Gov event. Now, of course, community is much more than event, but apart from that, yeah, it was very open. It was very free. It was like, if you have an interest in making government better, particularly if you're a policy or a delivery person, then please come. Yeah.
Did you have any pushback from the community or members of the community around that openness?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the breakfast I ran was in the Treasury, so it took a bit of effort for you to turn up and to get in, which in itself probably bred a bit of exclusivity. But no, I don't remember there being any kind of pushback in terms of like the kind of overall openness. And if anything, that was the thing that made One Team Gov as global as it was.
That's a good thing. Good example to think about, but I'm just thinking of other examples. So for example, there's the Slack group, the CrushGov Slack group, which you have to, like, which is almost the other extreme, because in that case, you have to have a UK government email to have access to the Slack. And then once you leave the government, you kind of lose access to that. And I mean, I guess that has worked well. I mean, UK Gov Slack has been quite successful in creating a community where people share and help each other out. But I know the exclusivity has also been frustrating for people who had access and then lost it.
Yeah, it's weird. Like the exclusivity is to do with, well, giving us a safe space so we can talk about stuff inside the public sector, which actually is kind of nullified by the fact that anyone can submit a freedom of information request and get details of any of the channels, any of the conversations, which people have done. So it's kind of weird that, and yes, there was an original list. I think it was all of the central government departments, which you could you could sign up with that email address and you get straight in. Nowadays, you can, as a member, invite anybody, and it's then down to the admins to decide whether or not they can come in or not, if the email address is outside of the kind of allow listed ones. I only know of 2 people who are in that Slack that currently don't have a government email address, but that's because they have worked so closely with the public sector for so long, or you know, they've helped set standards, or they've been particularly active, like, you know, investigator of what government's doing. So 2 out of 25,000, I think it is, that last time I looked, that have got membership is a very small ratio of like non-government email addresses.
And so how does it work? Because I mean, one of the things I mentioned sort of at the beginning is that one of the challenges with this is that people move so much. So when a person leaves government, how does the community maintain, like, so they would lose access? How did they lose access to it?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I left when I was last working in defence. So I had an mod.gov.uk email address, and that's the one I was using for the CrossGov Slack. And I left at the end of April. And theoretically, it still works. I could still log in. And what happens is, I think every 3 months or every quarter, the admins do a mass password reset. So it forces you, it logs everybody out, and then forces you to go back and change your password. So at that point, obviously, if I was still surreptitiously in the group, I would completely lose access because I'd no longer have access to my government email address. So, yeah, it's supposed to be public sector only, and it's kind of enforced.
When we talk about this, I mean, we've had lots of conversations about this at Apolitical, and we're constantly sort of reevaluating this. And one of the big things, the biggest thing for us at Apolitical, is this idea of trust. Trust from our community that we are creating, we're putting their interests first, their needs first, and that we're creating a safe space for them is foundational, and everything kind of rolls out from that. Which is why, you know, particularly now that the community, we've got these communities, and so you can see people's profiles and their job descriptions. You know, we're very sensitive to, like, if someone sees a consultant and in their job description when they go into a community, that could make them like, oh, consultants are here, oh boy. That's the thing that we're sort of fighting against, and we don't want to have happen. Journalist is the other one. So there's a couple key flags. Consultant's a flag, journalist is the other big flag. But my frustration with that has always been that there are consultants and journalists who add huge value to these communities, and kicking them out seems like a huge loss, particularly when they understand, you know, the code of conduct, the rules of the game. This isn't a place to sell. This is a place to help and support. The challenge with that, and so, like, I'm like, oh, can we make exceptions? But Robin, who's our CEO, kind of pushes back at me, like, the challenge with exceptions is it's not scalable. And one of the things we think about Apolitical is, like, it's one thing if you've got one community of 100 people, that's easy. But if you've got, you know, 50 communities that measure in the hundreds of thousands and millions of people, these exceptions no longer become viable. And so that's one of the things that sort of we've balanced it out, and that's why we have the sort of the rules of engagement and who can be in and who can't. But I do wonder about it. The other thing I struggle with around this is I see silos being formed around this stuff. So, for example, at Apolitical, we build these communities of practice, and then we say, you know, it can be only for public servants, but then there's all these other organizations that then they also create these communities of practice. Like Public Digital has some, the Beck Center has some, like all these different organizations have it, and they exact same rules of, like, we're creating this, it's a safe space for public servants, only public servants can be part of it. But then each of these organizations has their own incentives to create their own communities. And all of a sudden we have all of these communities being created everywhere that are just for public servants, but are being created by independent organizations. And that just seems to create new silos. And I really struggle with that, because a lot of the ideas of communities of practice is to break down these silos and to create spaces for us to connect and to collaborate. It's been something I've been wrestling with a lot in the last couple of months. I don't know what the answer is, other than to maybe get these groups together and just at least create some way that information can be shared across our different organizations.
It's interesting. You could make an argument that all communities are silos, you know, particularly where there is some sort of requirement or barrier to membership. And in some respects, it's a good thing, and in some respects, it's not. So the reason it's not, obviously, well, yes, because you're limiting. You have to be a certain type of individual with a certain type of role, remit, or responsibility to get into a community that's closed membership. If it's completely open, that's great. Anyone can come in, and then you're more into kind of the moderating, making sure, sticking to the code of conduct, all that kind of stuff. But as has happened with the Digital Minds community that James Reeve set up, who was one of the co-founders of Wanting Gov, that community is on it's on a Discord server, and anyone can join basically. But there isn't a community manager, and because it's so open and because there's no like ongoing management, yes, a few hundred people joined, but then it fizzled out. So that's an interesting, like, if you're going to have a completely open model, you need to have some proper active management of it. Whereas like with closed communities, and one I really love is this community for community managers called the Community, and they maybe have like 120, 200 or so members in there, and you have to apply, and they have quarterly application process. So 4 times a year you can apply to join, and the founder or founders will make a decision on whether or not you get in based on do you meet the requirements for membership. And that's actually one of the communities I enjoy the most, because it's relatively it feels a lot safer than other communities, because I know that all the people in there are very similar to me in terms of what we do, not as opposed to like who we are. And so the conversations usually are good, and questions get answered, and it's not massive. So if you look like an alternative, like sort of the CMX hub, which has got thousands of people in there, it's unwieldy. You know, you don't know where to go, and you don't know who to ask. So it's kind of pros and cons of like, do you have this open model with a code of conduct, or a closed model where somebody is a gatekeeper to entry? And it really depends, I suppose, on what the outcome of your community is. There are many different communities doing the same thing. Yeah, this is a constant battle. And even in communities for community managers, there are lots of communities for community managers. And in fact, I've had conversations recently with one of the leaders of one. It's like, well, should we close it down or merge it? And if not, well, how do we work collaboratively all across all these communities to like surface like the open standards? Because like 80%, there's like an 80% crossover, all these communities that are all doing the same thing. So why not just extract that 80% and put it somewhere else, and then focus on whatever the uniqueness of the individual communities are?
Yeah, no, I definitely like that. And I think it's something that as at Apolitical, as we get more and more communities, we're already having conversations being like, are these communities too similar? You know, do we got, you know, do we have one on customer experience and one on design, user-centered design, and one on, you know, UX, user experience? It's like, oh, these all sound similar. Are they distinct enough that we need to have separate communities, or should they all just be one? But this is where you also have like culture and egos, which lead to different communities as well, which is interesting to see. Yeah. Okay, so go ahead. Oh, you're going to say something.
I was just going to say, there's also a thing like, once you've started it and it's going well, like who can, like, if you're one of the organizers or like managers of the community, like who do I get to replace me? Like, I've reached a peak, great, let's find somebody else who can reach their peak, you know, and also like try to make whoever those organizers are as diverse as possible. Those two things really seem to really help communities stabilize or grow. So yeah.
So if we had to summarize key takeaways from this conversation, one is know what your first principles are as a community, like why does this community exist? And then from that, you'll have a clear idea of who the membership could be. 2, understand the pros and cons of having more open versus more closed communities. 3, maybe is like the practicality of it. What are if you're going to have an open community or a closed community, how is that going to be managed practically, and is that doable? I think those are probably 3 of my big takeaways from this.
Yeah, and then just also remembering the difference between what it means to be a membership criteria, and then working with the code of conduct on what those two separate things are and how they work together. Yeah.
Cool. I think that's a good way to wrap up our second podcast episode. Thanks, James.
Nice. See you in the next one.
Cheers.
Stop.